Hello, fellow seekers. This is part 2 of the series on Zeno's paradox. In part 1, we explored an ancient Greek thought experiment suggesting that if you shoot an arrow at a target, the arrow should, logically, never reach its destination. This is because it would first have to travel half the distance to the target, then half the remaining distance, then half of that remaining distance, and so on infinitely. The experiment assumes that any distance can be divided in half endlessly, meaning that the arrow would never actually arrive at the target. In part 2, we will add a new dimension to this thought experiment. Namely, let's add to this the idea that space is the universal substrate from which all other things are derived, where all things that exist are like ice sculptures in an infinite sea, all made of the same substrate, but never truly separate from each other. There is simply space and condensed space, matter and energy, and everything is a manifestation of space interacting with itself. Please see my related video, Something from Nothing, for more on this topic. By adding this dimension to the thought experiment, have we come closer to solving the paradox of the arrow? Let's discuss. Adding the idea that space is a universal substrate from which all things are derived adds a fascinating layer to the paradox. This conceptualization implies that matter and energy are not fundamentally distinct entities, but rather condensations or modulations of space itself. In this view, everything in existence is part of an interconnected, infinite ocean of space, where what we perceive as individual objects, such as the arrow, the target, and the archer, are merely patterns or densities within this substrate. Let's explore how this perspective might impact our understanding of Zeno's paradox. 1. Reimagining the arrow's motion as a flow within a unified substrate. If we consider space as the fundamental substrate and all matter and energy as condensed or structured forms of space, then the arrow's motion can be understood not as an object moving through a separate container of empty space, but as a shifting pattern within a continuous medium. This means the arrow doesn't so much traverse distance in a traditional sense, but instead represents an evolving dynamic form within a connected field. In this framework, the arrow's motion might be seen as analogous to a wave moving across water. A wave doesn't move individual water molecules from one point to another. Instead, it is a pattern that travels through the medium. Likewise, if the arrow is simply a localized condensation or density of space, then its motion might be an expression of spatial continuity rather than discrete steps or segments. This could dissolve the paradox by reframing the notion of motion itself. Instead of a series of distinct positions separated by infinitely divisible gaps, the arrow is a continuous pattern in a sea of space, evolving rather than moving in the classical sense. Counter-argument. Even if the arrow is a wave-like pattern within space, one might argue that it still must undergo some form of spatial progression from the archer to the target. The notion of space as a substrate may change how we view the nature of objects, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate the concept of distance. If there remains a gap between the initial and final states of the pattern, Zeno's question of traversing infinite steps might still apply. 2. Redefining distance as an emergent quality of space. If space is a universal substrate with all things as condensed expressions of it, distance itself might be understood as an emergent quality of spatial relationships rather than an independent, absolute reality. In this view, distance doesn't truly exist apart from the interactions and relationships between different condensations of space, e.g. the arrow and the target. Distance could be seen as a byproduct of the relational structure within space, rather than a fundamental quality that must be crossed. In this framework, Zeno's paradox becomes a question of relational dynamics rather than physical traversal. Since the arrow, target, and all other objects are manifestations within a single substrate, the concept of traveling through independent segments loses meaning. Instead, the arrow's approach to the target is a shift in the internal structure of space itself. The arrow doesn't cross a series of gaps because there are no gaps in a unified substrate. What we perceive as motion is a continuous shift in the relationships within space. Counter-argument. While this view provides a novel way of conceptualizing space, it may seem like an abstraction that avoids addressing the actual experience of motion. If distance is purely relational, does that mean all objects are fundamentally at rest, with motion merely a perception within our consciousness? This might be unsatisfactory from a physical perspective, as it implies that the tangible experience of motion is illusory. 3. The paradox as a misinterpretation of interacting densities within space. If space is both the substrate and the source of all matter, we can think of the arrow and target as temporary structures within this boundless sea, akin to ice sculptures in water. The arrow, then, is not moving through empty space toward the target. Rather, it is a shifting concentration within an interconnected field, moving in harmony with the dynamics of the surrounding space. From this perspective, Zeno's paradox could be seen as a misunderstanding that assumes separateness where none exists. The arrow and the target are both structures within a single indivisible medium, meaning that distance is a conceptual convenience rather than an actual separation. Thus, if the arrow and target are interdependent patterns in the same substrate, there's no need for the arrow to cross infinite divisions, as its movement is an expression of space rearranging itself. Motion becomes an internal process of the substrate rather than a traversal across distinct locations. Just as ripples in a pond aren't independent entities traveling through water, but expressions of the water itself shifting, the arrow's motion is a change in the density and configuration of space. Counter-argument. This approach does seem to sidestep the paradox by proposing that separations and distances are illusions within a single, unified field. However, this interpretation raises another issue. If distance is illusory, how do we reconcile this with our everyday experience, where distances feel very real? Moreover, it implies a level of interconnectivity in which individual objects lose their distinctness, challenging our conventional understanding of object boundaries. 4. The infinite substrate and the concept of boundlessness. If space is a boundless substrate, infinitely divisible and infinitely continuous, then Zeno's paradox may stem from our failure to comprehend infinity within a unified field. We are accustomed to thinking of infinity as something endless and separate. Yet if everything, including the arrow and target, is made of the same boundless substance, then each part of space is already connected to every other part. In this view, the concept of an infinite number of steps becomes irrelevant because there's no actual separation between points within a boundless substrate. The arrow and target are already connected through the infinite nature of space, and motion is the realization of this inherent connection rather than a traversal of distinct segments. Counter-argument. This view might imply that all events are pre-connected within a timeless, boundless substrate, leading to determinism. If space is truly boundless and all motion is simply the expression of a pre-existing connection, then this might mean that the arrow's trajectory to the target is an inevitable outcome, raising questions about free will and agency. 5. Matter and energy as space interacting with itself. If all matter and energy are forms of space interacting with itself, then the arrow's motion could be seen as an internal dynamic of space. This interpretation suggests that what we see as the arrow's trajectory is not an object moving independently through space, but rather space-changing state, as one part of the substrate flows into another. In this model, Zeno's paradox might arise because we mistake the arrow for an independent object, separate from space, that must cross a series of divisions. Instead, we might think of the arrow as a wave within the fabric of space itself. Each step of the arrow's journey is simply a transformation in the spatial substrate, with no actual division between parts. Thus, the paradox dissolves, as there is no need for the arrow to traverse independent sections of space. It is merely space moving through itself in a continuous transformation. Counter-argument. This resolution raises a significant philosophical question. If objects are not distinct from the space they occupy, what defines their identity? Does this mean that the arrow, target, and all other objects lack true individuality? This view may be conceptually coherent, but challenging to reconcile with our lived experience of distinct objects and boundaries. 6. Infinity as the fundamental quality of space. Viewing space as the fundamental, infinitely divisible, and infinitely connected substrate brings us to a novel resolution of the paradox. It suggests that the problem of crossing infinite divisions is rooted in our limited perception. We are accustomed to viewing objects and space as distinct, with motion requiring an object to traverse an independently existing medium. However, if everything is part of a single infinite field of space, then there is no true crossing or traversal. The arrow is not traversing space. It is space, expressing itself as an evolving form. This interpretation implies that motion, distance, and separateness are not objective properties of reality, but relational aspects of how space manifests. Infinity isn't something the arrow encounters in its journey. It's a fundamental aspect of what the arrow, space, and target are. Zeno's paradox dissolves because the arrow and target are not fundamentally separate. They are boundless, interconnected forms within the same infinite substrate. Conclusion: a new perspective on Zeno's paradox. By conceiving of space as the universal substrate from which all things are derived, we arrive at a perspective in which the arrow's motion is not a traversal of discrete steps, but an unfolding of space itself. The paradox may arise not because motion is impossible, but because we mistakenly conceive of objects as separate from the space they inhabit. When viewed as patterns within a boundless, infinite substrate, the concepts of separation and distance become fluid, and the paradox loses its footing. In this framework, Zeno's paradox is resolved by understanding that the arrow, the target, and the distance between them are interconnected manifestations of a single, infinite reality. Motion is not an object moving through discrete spatial divisions, but a continuous reconfiguration of a unified space. This view invites a radically interconnected conception of reality, where all distinctions are ultimately part of the same infinite substance, and motion is simply the dynamic interplay of space with itself. Thank you for spending time with me in the great abyss of knowledge that we call home.